I have a thing about suits. I particularly love the suit I'm wearing today. I'm probably a bit vain, actually, about my suits, and some of you may have noticed. I only ever buy them from charity shops, and I never pay more than £25 for a new suit. They have to be in good condition, and they have to be a perfect fit. And every now and again I find a superb bargain, and today I am modelling what may be my finest ever charity shop purchase, a Ted Baker suit, brand new with tags, at less than £20. The thing is that at some point over the course of the past year, I've splashed some bleach on it so that it is now blemished. You can't see the blemish, but it's here and here. And it's just taken the edge off the pleasure that I get from wearing this suit, and I don't wear it so much anymore. And I think that there is a similar but much more serious problem at stake with Psalm 139. I think for some people it would be the most beautiful psalm in the Psalter if it wasn't for the blemish in the last 6 verses, which talk about hating people. It feels, that last section, like a snag, like a stain. And so people are not quite so happy to turn to Psalm 139 as they would be otherwise. Or else, because you can do this with a psalm in a way that you can't with a suit. They just cut out that section without realizing that the damage is every bit as catastrophic as if I were to cut off the entire leg of this suit because of the small blemish caused by the bleach. This psalm, Psalm 139, hangs together as a complete whole. Cut out the final section and you risk missing the point altogether. So this morning I'm going to offer you an exposition of the psalm in full, including the last 6 verses. Now, because the keynote address later this morning from Pete Gregg, the other Pete, is about prayer, I instinctively turned, when I was thinking about a Bible passage that we might explore together this morning, I instinctively turned to the Psalms, because the Psalms are prayers, aren't they? They're a storehouse of prayers, and I had 150 to choose from. But here's the thing. Lots of psalms are not actually spoken to God. Many psalms have bits which are not spoken to God, but some psalms are not spoken to God from first to last. Think of Psalm 121, for example, the psalm that was sung at the committal of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in St. George's Chapel at the end of the funeral day less than a couple of weeks ago. From first to last, Psalm 121 talks about the Lord in the third person, not to the Lord in the second person. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where will my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. And lots of psalms do this. They speak about God rather than to God. And I absolutely want to maintain that using those psalms is also prayer, because saying those psalms, praying those psalms, does deliver a heightened sense of the believer in the presence of the living God. And ultimately, that is what I believe prayer to be. It is a cultivating, actively, intentionally cultivating a sense that you are now in the presence of the living God. And yet, I want to say that because prayer is, in essence, about creating a space in which the relationship of the believer and the living God can flourish and grow, I do think that the purest form of prayer really is the outpouring of words, the outpouring of the soul to God. And that, in the end, is what took me to Psalm 139 for today. Arguably, the psalm with the strongest sense of I and thou, of the believer pouring out the soul in the presence, into the ears of the living God. I'd argue that if the relationship between a human being and the Creator is the most basic relationship of all, then it follows that prayer is the most essential, most life-giving, most life-affirming activity of all. And that learning to speak to God in prayer and learning to hear from God in prayer is not just the most important, but the most precious and beautiful thing a human being can do. And we'll find that dynamic played out most clearly in Psalm 139. And now let's hear it read. Beth.
O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me. Your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will cover me, and night wraps itself around me, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. I try to count them. There are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me. Those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and do not loathe those who rise up against you. I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them as my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting.
Thank you, Beth. So let me get some technical stuff out of the way to begin with. Some of you will have heard me say before that although Holy Scripture is, of course, always more than carefully crafted literature, it is seldom less than that. Although Holy Scripture is always, of course, more than carefully crafted literature, it is seldom less than that. And I'm convinced that very often it is in the carefully crafted structure of a biblical text that we can most reliably get to its meaning. And Psalm 139 is a really good case in point. You'll have seen from the way in which it appeared on the screen, the text, that it breaks into 4 neat, tidy sections, each of 6 verses, with what we might call brackets or bookends in the first and in the penultimate verses of the psalm, both of which refer to search and know, verses 1 and 23. And in addition, the first and third sections balance one another. Both of them use the word wonderful to describe the relationship of the psalmist to God. And sections 2 and 4 also balance one another with a pair of questions appearing in both sections. And you'll find lots of other verbal links holding the psalm together, references to thoughts and count and way and hand. But the golden thread that runs right the way through the psalm is definitely the language of relationship, the repetition of the words you and I. In just 24 verses, you'll find 29 second-person pronouns, you and your, and 49 first-person pronouns, I and me and my. This is a psalm about me, the psalmist, held in relationship to you, O God. And what I'm wanting to suggest this morning is that the whole of verses 1 to 18, which many people regard as some of the most beautiful words in the Bible, are actually only there to prepare the way for verses 19 to 24, which some people regard as some of the most ugly words in the Bible. I want to suggest that it's only on the basis of the first 3 sections that the psalmist can utter the words in the final section, and that it is actually only in the final 6 verses that the psalmist gets round to pouring out to God what is really on the psalmist's heart, what the psalmist is really feeling. So the psalm turns out to be, I want to suggest, a plea for vindication in the face of false accusation. It is not just a rather lovely meditation on what it means to be created as a human being. It's a desperate cry for God's help when your reputation is under fire. And if your reputation has ever been under fire, you might be quite glad to pray this way. I'll try to explain. So, first of all, then, the opening 6 verses, section 1, in which we get an assertion of the Lord's absolute knowledge, of God knowing everything, of what philosophers call God's omniscience. God is all-knowing, and God would not be God if that were not true. So listen to the opening verse. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. Verse 2, you know when I sit and when I rise up. Verse 4, even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it altogether. Verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. But in fact, unlike the philosophers, the psalmist is not quite saying that God knows everything. The psalmist is saying, God knows all about me. God knows the prayer of the psalm through and through. So you'll find that first-person pronoun, I, me, my, 13 times in the opening 6 verses, 5 times in the opening 2 verses. Oh Lord, you've searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. And that little phrase, when I sit down and when I rise up, is what in hermeneutics is called a merism. It's using 2 extreme things as a way of summing up everything in between. So when I sit down and when I rise up doesn't mean that God is only watching when I sit down and when I rise up. It means whatever I am doing, God's eye is upon me. In fact, God knows not only our actions, but our words. And our words before we speak them, therefore our thoughts as well. And verse 5 might sound scary or ominous. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Doesn't sound very comfortable to be hemmed in. But verse 6 makes it clear that this is a positive experience for the psalmist. So it must mean hemmed in the sense of defended, protected, not trapped or restricted. The Lord's hand upon the psalmist to protect, not to oppress. Because the psalmist finishes, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, so high I cannot attain it. There is delight for the psalmist in being known, utterly, comprehensively known by the Maker. That's section 1. If section 1 emphasizes that God knows everything, is omniscient, as the philosophers like to say, then section 2 in verses 7 to 12 emphasizes that God is everywhere or omnipresent. God is all-filling. And God would not be God if that were not true. But again, the interest of the psalmist is not intellectual, it's experiential. It's not a conceptual question whether God is everywhere. It's a deeply personal affirmation that there is nowhere I can go where God is not. So verse 7 introduces a kind of cosmic game of hide and seek in which the psalmist discovers or has to acknowledge that there is nowhere that the psalmist can go to escape the presence of God. And again, there are merisms, two extremes which stand for everything in between. In verse 8, heaven, the place above the earth, and Sheol, the place below the earth, stand for everything in between. In verse 9, the morning, the wings of the morning means the east, the place of the sunrise. And the farthest limits of the sea means the end of the Mediterranean, the west, and everywhere in between. No matter where the psalmist goes, the hand, which in section 1, verse 5, was laid upon the psalmist, will in section 2, verse 10, lead the psalmist and hold the psalmist fast. It's not quite clear to me whether in the last 2 verses of this section, darkness is literal night or a metaphor for, death or depression. But given the where questions with which this section begins and the if statements in verses 8, 9, and 11, I'm inclined to say it doesn't matter. It's all of the above. It means nighttime cannot separate you from the presence of God. It means depression cannot separate you from the presence of God. It means death cannot separate you from the presence of God. That's section 2. So if, to stick with philosophical categories, section 1 is about the omniscience of the Lord and section 2 is about the omnipresence of the Lord, then arguably section 3 in verses 13 to 18 is about the omnipotence of the Lord. It's about the fact that God made everything. God is all-powerful, and God would not be God if that were not true. But again, the psalmist is not asserting quite that God made everything, but wonderfully that God made everything about me. Verses 13 to 15 are sacred ground, and I want to tread very carefully on them. They testify, so it seems to me, to the creative, purposeful activity of God in the womb, and I believe that does inform a Christian doctrine of life. Human life is not only precious, but individually formed, knit together, to quote verse 13, intricately woven, to quote verse 15, from the moment of conception. What verse 16 calls the unformed substance of a person is precious to God. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when as yet none of them existed. So these verses incline most Christians towards a sense of the sanctity of life from the moment of conception. And yet this is not quite a slam-dunk argument against abortion. There are many circumstances, including miscarriage and stillbirth, in which conception does not issue in life, in which conception does not issue in days of life numbered before one of them came to be. And I don't think I'm imagining things if I say that this mystery and this ethical dilemma are implied in the closing verses of the section. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God? How vast is the sum of them? I tried to count them. They're more than the sand. I come to the end, I'm still with you. In the end, the psalmist is overwhelmed by the enormity, the infinity of God's creative power and purpose. But, and, whatever else is true, when everything else has been taken into account, the psalmist can say, because of God's omnipotence, I'm still with you. Whatever unfolds in life, whatever ethical dilemmas I have to navigate, whatever horrors I may experience, I am still with you. This is what it means to say God is omnipotent. God is sovereign over all things, even my own circumstances, my situation, my sorrows. And that brings us to the last section, to verses 19 to 24. If I am reading the psalm correctly, the psalmist has emphasized in deeply personal terms that the Lord is all-knowing or omniscient, all-filling or omnipresent, and all-powerful or omnipotent. Why? Well, I think we need to read the final section from the end to the beginning. So look at verses 23 and 24. Here the psalmist asks the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent Lord to search and know, to test and know his or her heart or thoughts, to see if there is any wicked way in him or her. Why? Well, I am persuaded that it's because the psalmist was under attack at exactly this point. I'm convinced that the apparently sudden shift in verse 19 to the wicked and the bloodthirsty is because the psalmist was under assault. When he refers in verse 20 to those who speak of you maliciously, I think he probably means those who speak of me maliciously, or at least those who speak of you and me maliciously, or those who speak of me maliciously and by implication maliciously about you too, O God. Likewise, when he refers to those who lift themselves up against you for evil, I think it's likely means those who lift themselves up for evil against me and by implication, Lord God, are maliciously conspiring against your name. In any case, please notice that the final section closes as well as opens with a reference to the wicked. And in verse 19, it is the wicked out there. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God. But in verse 24, it's the wicked in here. See if there is any wicked way in me. So if verses 19 to 22 teeter on the brink of self-righteousness, there's no doubt that verses 23 and 24 draw back from the brink. My friends, I must stop. Here's the point. For the psalmist, who I strongly suspect is subject at the point of writing to slander and insult, it is a huge consolation to know that God is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, not least in relationship to me. God knows everything, is everywhere, and is almighty. So God knows me through and through. God is with me through and through. God made me through and through, so that there are no secrets from God, no surprises to him. My weaknesses and my shortcomings, they're already known to him. My activity and inactivity, they're already known to him. My ability and my inability, they're already known to him. So no one can say anything about me which will damage my standing in God's sight. The worst about me is already known to the God who made me and loves me. Philip Yancey has written, "There is nothing I could do to make God love me more, and there's nothing I could do to make God love me less." That's the perspective of the psalmist. My dear friends, it is gloriously good news in Jesus Christ that God searches us and knows us. The searching and knowing are stated as a fact in verse 1, from which we cannot escape, even if we wanted to. But they're stated as an invitation in verse 23, so that in prayer we can say, Lord, search me and know me. Prayer can be the space in which we are utterly ourselves, authentically, truly, transparently ourselves in the presence of God. The challenge of the psalm is for each one of us in prayer to see ourselves as God sees us, and not to believe the myth. Either the myth our own inner voices is telling us, or the myth of our opponents and accusers. I say, thank God for the last 6 verses of Psalm 139. We've got some questions, I think, which are wordy, I've been told. So they're on the screen. Of course, you may want to talk about your best ever charity shop purchase, and that's fine. But since we are gathered to consider prayer, I want to invite you to talk with one another, maybe in 2s, 3s, 4s, just randomly, casually, as you're seated. Do you like to use the Psalms when you pray? And if so, which ones? And if not, any sense of why you don't turn to the Psalms when you pray? Alternatively, or then, if the words of a psalm are not addressed directly to God, do they still work as prayers for you in your experience? And in Psalm 139, verse 1, Lord, you've searched me and you know me. Is that a comfort to you, or if you're honest, is it a worry? And again, can you say why? I think we've got 8 minutes just to talk to one another before we break.